It's a quirk of history that England used to own part of France, and without France, England as we know it could never have come to be. It all goes back to the Vikings, whose superior naval architecture allowed them to seize control of vast regions in both England and France. Their descendants vied for preeminence in both, and for almost 2 centuries, the kings of England also ruled huge swaths of western France, with titles like Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and Duke of Aquitaine. In 1066, a Norman French duke successfully conquered the whole of England, a mere 150 years after a French king paid the duke's Viking great-great-great-grandfather to stop attacking Paris and just go away. The place these Vikings just went away to happened to lie directly across the Channel from England. After their Norman Conquest, the kings of England still held their French titles, nominally as vassals of whichever king happened to sit on the French throne, but in reality as de facto independent sovereigns over their respective regions. In many ways, England became just another region ruled by a French Norman overlord. Tellingly, the official language of the English court continued to be French for another 300 years almost, with the key distinction being that the French overlord in England was also her legally and fully sovereign king. This situation in France came to a head when the French king died in 1328, and his nearest male relative turned out to be the King of England. But the French magnates didn't want to be ruled by an English king. And so, after contorting themselves into a misogynistic semantic pretzel, proclaimed a slightly more distant male relative, Philip of Valois, as King of France. Philip decided that he'd seen enough of English kings ruling in his western domains, and so he confiscated them. Rather than attacking the confiscation, however, the English king escalated, declaring himself rightful king of France, and unleashing a war which would last more than 5 generations. In what became known as the 100 Years' War, the English were, at first, astonishingly successful, ravaging French lands and defeating French armies, capturing towns and castles, and ransoming French nobles. They even captured and ransomed the French king himself. He died in London in 1370, still a captive. But the English were eventually driven all the way back to the British Isles, and the French House of Valois was confirmed in its royal line of succession. Never again would an English king rule on the continent. The war was important not only for the havoc it wreaked on French and English society, but because it marked the beginning of the decline of feudalism itself in Western Europe. It posed fundamental questions about the legitimacy of the entire social hierarchy in general, and this early Battle of Crécy highlighted its shortcomings in stark, unmistakable relief. Before Crécy, in everyone's minds reaching back through time immemorial, knights had been the dominant force on the battlefield. They were ferocious killing machines, intimidating to the common peasants, every one of whom generally experienced their entire lives under the governing auspices of whichever lord, also a knight, happened to have been granted the land to which each peasant was legally attached. In peacetime everyday life, the Lord Knight would sit at the head of his own local legal court, adjudicating any disputes and generally having the final say on any local matters within his lands. The peasants had no rights. Knights were the members of the nobility, trained in combat from a young age. They fought on horseback, encased in armor, wielding weapons that required significant finances and skill to both buy and use effectively. In the feudal system, they were considered the elite, both militarily and socially. The Battle of Crécy challenged this existing military and societal paradigm for the first time. The dynamic English king, Edward III, having already ruled by this point for 19 years, learned early in his reign through smaller campaigns in Scotland that longbows in sufficient concentration could defeat a superior number of mounted knights or men-at-arms. He therefore overbalanced his army's longbowmen numbers, a force made up largely of commoners and peasants. Longbows were relatively inexpensive to produce and required less training than the weapons typically wielded by the knights. They also had a longer range and a higher rate of fire compared to the crossbows used by the French. The English also had a special arrowhead design called the bodkin point. The bodkin was a narrow, square section or diamond-shaped point that was designed to penetrate armor. Though not as lethal as a broadhead point against lightly armored or unarmored opponents, the bodkin point had a more streamlined profile that allowed it to slip through the gaps in plate armor, or to penetrate chainmail and the padded armor worn underneath. Beginning in the late August afternoon and continuing until well after nightfall, the mounted French forces unrelentingly charged again and again into the rapid-fire teeth of the English bodkin tips, only to have all of those charges peter out and fail, not unlike the repeated charges against machine guns 5.5 centuries later on the Western Front, and with similarly horrific results. So that by the time the mists cleared the next morning, nothing less than the butchering of the flower of French nobility became evident. King Philip VI narrowly escaped the carnage, convinced by his advisors to flee into the night and live to fight another day, but his country and his reign had been forever changed. Because the English victory at Crécy turned existing notions of military prowess onto their heads by demonstrating that well-positioned, well-led, and well-equipped commoners could easily defeat noble, landed knights, whose societal responsibilities they therefore deemed them to have abrogated. The Battle of Crécy was therefore the coming out party not only of England's new secret weapon, but the inauguration of an entirely new way of thinking. Before the English longbow, expensive plate armor was effective protection against most arrows on most battlefields. After the English longbow, it was forever not. As a result, Crécy contributed to the democratization of military service and the gradual erosion of the traditional feudal system. It marked a shift toward larger, more professional standing armies, where discipline, organization, and individuals practicing as a team became the keys to military success, rather than a hereditary bloodline of individual elite designated warriors. The battle also had implications for social mobility. As commoners became increasingly crucial to military success, they began to gain more respect and more leverage in society. The prestige and importance of the knightly class decreased, which had a profound effect on the social fabric of Western Europe, leading to greater opportunities for the lower classes. This helped to break down some societal barriers, helping pave the way for the eventual rise of a new, legitimate, respected middle class. No longer could an idle peasant be rounded up by any old overseer and set to work in the fields. He was on a mission. He had his longbow to practice. This raised the status of archers from simple peasants to essential members of society, with skills that were valuable and highly sought after. The dawning prestige of the commons in military affairs would contribute to their growing importance within the political sphere as well, imparting an increased legitimacy to their voices within the English Parliament and across pre-Enlightenment Europe. Kings and nobles couldn't just ignore the importance of their non-noble subjects anymore. The rise of professional armies comprised of well-paid and well-trained commoners allowed monarchs to exert their power more directly, bypassing the nobles, which slowly led to the centralization of royal authority and the move toward nation statehood. Simply put, the red blood of the common infantry and the blue blood of the mounted nobility could now flow equally and indiscriminately, at a distance, without ever having to come to grips. That stark reality prompted the beginning of a gradual but inescapable transformation in the way people fundamentally viewed themselves, each other, and society in general. Crécy was therefore the beginning of the end of their very way of life, and because of that, it remains a watershed moment in the development of the modern world. The Black Death, which broke out a mere 2 years later in Europe, would turbocharge the pace and breadth of this fundamental transformation. But that is another story for another video. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, but only if you think I've earned it. And I look forward to seeing you again next time. I'm Marcus, and I really appreciate you. Thank you.